Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Theodore Roosevelt, and the focus is doctrine, the square deal, and the big stick. The year is 1904, and Roosevelt has just finished 3.5 years as President of the United States, having taken over for William McKinley, who had been assassinated back in 1901. Now Roosevelt is running for election in his own right, and not only does he win, he wins big. He beats Judge Alton Parker of the Democrats 336 to 140 in the Electoral College. It was 32 states to 13 for Parker. And if you look at the popular vote, 56.4% went for Roosevelt. That was the largest margin in the popular vote, really, since they had been keeping track and the electorate had expanded way back in the 1820s. So he is riding high, and on election night, he surprises everyone with the following statement. The wise custom which limits the president to 2 terms regards the substance and not the form, and under no circumstances will I be a candidate for and accept the nomination for another. Now, some had speculated that maybe it's because Roosevelt had been criticized for the imperial presidency that he was running with his expansive use of the executive power, and maybe he wanted to diffuse that by saying, look, I'm not going to serve any more than anybody else. But surprised a lot of people that he would sort of take that off the table so soon. And in fact, one of the people who was most disappointed was his wife, Edith. She enjoyed being First Lady, and she didn't like the fact that this was seemingly going to be the end of it. But this was Roosevelt's statement. And he would later regret it. He would eventually repudiate it outright. But for now, this was his stand. He gets ready for his second term. Before he even gets inaugurated, though, he's still making policy toward the end of his first term. And in his annual message in 1904 to Congress, comes in December, he decides to actually create his own doctrine. Now, this is a version of the Monroe Doctrine, which had been established almost a century before, when James Monroe, the 5th president, basically told Europe, you stay out of the Americas, no more colonies in the Americas, and by the way, we'll stay out of Europe. We're not going to colonize anything there. And for the most part, that doctrine had held up. Well, Roosevelt was ready to take it a step further. He was concerned that there were too many fragile states in the Americas, and that they were always succumbing to either potential revolution, or in one case, in Venezuela's case, they couldn't pay their debts, so Europe was all hot and bothered about that. And basically, Roosevelt said that he, the United States, now has the authority to go in and clean up these messes if they are out of control, really anywhere in the Americas. In his speech, he makes the point, chronic wrongdoing or an impotence which results in a general loosening of the ties of civilized society may force the United States, however reluctantly, in flagrant cases of such wrongdoing or impotence, to the exercise of an international police power. Now think about that for a moment. The United States for over 100 years had been a neutral power. They didn't get involved in foreign conflicts of any kind. McKinley and Roosevelt had already sort of put that aside when they went to war with Spain just a few years before. And Roosevelt had already shown some inclinations to be more engaged militarily in the area. But now he was making it official. If you mess up in your territory, the U.S. will be the regional police force. Now, you can imagine that these other nations were not quite happy with Roosevelt's assertion, and neither were many of the American people, who also weren't thinking that this was the right kind of foreign policy. And frankly, Roosevelt didn't care what any of them thought, and he thought that they were just frankly wrong. His job was to do good for the world. The United States had this power to enforce good works, and as long as everyone was behaving, there was never going to be a problem. If you weren't behaving, then we'll come in and clean it up. He never really probably thought of, well, what if another leader, maybe a European power, had said that about the United States? How do you think he would have reacted? But of course, such a thought probably never even occurred to him. So from a doctrine standpoint, the United States had now declared under Theodore Roosevelt this international police power for any states within the Americas, North, South, and Central, that couldn't handle their own business. The United States will be there to clean it up for you. Progressivism was really the heart of Theodore Roosevelt's philosophy when it came to politics. He believed that the government could be a force for good, and is sort of followed again from his father's teachings, his moral foundation of right and wrong, where, again, he had in his mind, especially now that he was president, that he could determine right and wrong and when the government, in this case, could or should intervene. So he called this policy his square deal, in particular when it came to labor. He made the point, my action on labor should always be considered in connection with my action as regards capital, and both are reducible to my favorite formula, a square deal for every man. This phrase, this concept, was embraced by most of the American people because they trusted Roosevelt to be the honest broker between the good trusts and the bad trusts, the good unions and the bad unions. It wasn't that all were good or all were bad. Theodore Roosevelt, our president, is going to figure out which ones are good or bad, and then he'll take action. If they're bad, he'll engage. We'll have policy. We'll have laws. And so in a number of progressive era areas, he did engage. He engaged in the meatpacking industry. He advocated for women's labor rights, child labor rights, workers' compensation, transparency in food and drugs, fairness in rate charging by railroads when he got extra power for the Interstate Commerce Commission. All of these areas, and there were many more, were part of his idea of a square deal, where the government, with him in particular making these decisions, had a role and an obligation to go and be a referee. And if somebody was playing not by the right rules, he would step in. It was a little tricky, of course, because those rules weren't always written down. Sometimes it was in his mind what was a good trust or a bad trust, but he was fairly consistent, and he was not shy about taking action. Now, sometimes he didn't have to take action. And this was his philosophy about carrying the big stick. This phrase, speak softly. Sometimes he spoke loudly, by the way, but you could speak softly and you would carry the big stick. The big stick oftentimes being the threat. And Roosevelt acted on his threats enough that everyone knew he was serious. And what he mainly used as his threat, particularly in international situations, was his Navy. He had been the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He had studied the Navy from his early college days. He believed firmly that a strong U.S. Navy was its ticket to these international issues where he could weigh in and the United States could weigh in on behalf of everyone else and sort of trying to do the right thing. So he had been advocating for a large Navy. He had now up to 20 ships, 20 battleships that had been built in just the last decade or so. They had used some of these in defeating the Spanish in the recent war. He had used the threat of his Navy to get Germany to go to arbitration with Venezuela over one of those conflicts that he had talked about. He had used the threat of the Navy to make sure Colombia didn't get in the way when Panama broke off and wanted to be its own country. Roosevelt liked that because then he could build his canal between east and west through Panama. He also used the Navy when Santo Domingo, a neighboring independent nation, was getting a little out of control, to enforce his corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Let's send in the Navy, and frankly, just by the presence of his Navy, the Santo Domingans came back into order. So Roosevelt has an idea, about a year left in his presidency, to send a signal to the world. He's going to send 16 American battleships and a bunch of other ships as well on a world tour. And they're going to call it the Great White Fleet. Now, Roosevelt says this is mainly because we need the practice, we need to get our Navy out there and have these various conditions that you can only experience when you're actually at sea. What he was really doing, of course, was making it clear to all the foreign countries around the world that the United States has the Navy. It's the powerful Navy, now the second most powerful Navy in the world next to England. And by the way, he wouldn't be afraid to use it. In particular, Japan was the nation he wanted to impress this notion upon. There had been some saber rattling with Japan over some immigration laws that had been passed in California. And Roosevelt was trying to broker that deal to get the Japanese to back off. But just in case, he thought, wouldn't it be great if we send 16 battleships around the world, including through the waters of Japan? So the Great White Fleet, Roosevelt launches them off to great fanfare, and about a month left in his presidency, he welcomes them back tremendous success, and he actually makes the statement, in my own judgment, the most important service that I rendered to peace was the voyage of the battle fleet around the world. That was him speaking softly, but carrying that big stick all the way around the world, and sure enough, people noticed. What he wondered, though, is how his successors would take this, and would they be as effective? Those are stories, though, for another day. For now, that is Theodore Roosevelt, his doctrine, the square deal, and the big stick, from the life of Theodore Roosevelt. For more Presidential Chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.